So this week I finally got around to replacing the front crossmember bushings on my 1979 MGB. Now this is a project I've been putting off for a while now, and decided with all the time at home, now was finally the time to get it done. There wasn't too much information I could find in the Chilton's manual, and I looked for some videos on YouTube and couldn't really find anything, so hopefully this video can help someone out. I found most of my information on how to do this from threads on MGEXP, as well as asking some questions in local Facebook groups. So with that being said, I'm not saying this is the best way to do it, not even saying that it's the right way to do it, but this worked for me. So these are the bushings that I got here. These are polyurethane bushings I got from Moss Motors a few years back. As you can see, there's 6 of them with a small flange on one end, and then there are 2 that are completely flat. Now if you have a chrome bumper MG, you're going to want 4 of the flanged ones and then 4 of the flat ones. In terms of tools, it's pretty basic. I just used a 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch wrench, as well as 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch socket, a hammer, and then a Phillips head screwdriver. The first thing you're going to want to do is remove the spring and spring pan. Now based on what I read, this isn't necessary, but it does make the job a whole hell of a lot easier. I don't have a spring compressor in my garage, so this is how I remove the springs. Here's a little video of my setup, but what you're going to want to do is loosen the nut on the sway bar end link and then the bolt on the outer rear of the spring pan. Then you're going to want to support the inner part of the spring pan with a floor jack and then remove those 2 inside bolts. Once you've got those 2 inside bolts out, slowly lower the jack until you can take the spring out, and then fully remove the nut for the sway bar end link and the remaining bolts so that you can remove the spring pan. Next thing you're going to want to do is remove the 4 bolts that attach the steering rack to the front cross member. After that, unscrew the little sheet metal screw that's holding the brake line to the frame rail. We don't want to accidentally break off any of our brake lines here. So now we can finally get into removing the front cross member. Using a floor jack, you're going to want to support the front cross member. Now you're not lifting the car, you're just supporting the weight of that cross member. Once you have the cross member supported, you're going to loosen the 2 lower nuts holding the front cross member to the frame rails. And you're going to do this on each side. And again, you're not taking these nuts all the way off, you're just cracking them loose. The rear one is fairly easy to find and reach with just a 3/4 inch socket. I was able to get all the bolts off by hand, but you might have to use an impact if it's really rusted on there. Now the front ones are going to be a little bit trickier to find and to get to. If you look through the opening behind where the spring would be, you can see the nut. And you can use either a socket extension with a U-joint, or you can reach through that opening behind where the spring would be with a small enough ratchet. I was able to use the ratchet with just a deep well socket, and that worked perfectly for me. Now after you've got both of those loosened, you're going to want to loosen the 2 top nuts. And you can find those in the engine bay. Once you loosen those, you're going to want to get the pins out, but in order to do that, you're probably going to have to give it a few good hits with a hammer. So you want to unscrew those nuts so that the top of the nut is flush with the top of the pin, and then give it a few whacks with a hammer until it falls through. Now you want to do this just to make sure you protect the threads on the pins and you don't mess anything up. After a few good hits, they should fall down and you'll be able to fully remove those pins. Here you can see the rear pin removed with the lower bushing on it. On my car, the top bushings were basically non-existent, and the bottoms were not in too good of shape either. And then here you can see the old bushing versus the new bushing on the front pins. As you can see, there is a world of difference. Next up, you're going to want to slowly lower the front cross member enough to install your new upper bushings. Both of the upper bushings should have a flange on them, and that flange should be facing downwards towards the front cross member. Next, install the new lower bushings on the pins and slide the pins up into the cross member. And again, the rear lower bushing is the one without the flange. Next up, you're going to lift the cross member with the jack, making sure to align the pins with the holes in the frame rails. Once you see that pin poking through the top, you're going to attach the top nut. This part can be a little tricky if you're alone, so it might not be a bad idea to get someone to help and just get those top nuts started while you're holding up the pins from underneath. Now, to ensure that we can lower the other side of the cross member and get those pins out, you're not going to want to tighten these nuts up all the way just yet, just get them snug. Now you can go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, and once you've done both the left and the right side, you can snug up all those top and bottom bolts and start to reattach everything that you've taken off. First thing that I reattached was the steering rack. You might have to loosen up the U-joint on the steering shaft in order to get the steering rack back on. And then those 4 bolts that hold the steering rack on, you're going to torque those down to 30 foot-pounds. Next up, you're going to reattach the small screw that holds the brake line to the frame, and then you can get to reinstalling the springs. Now, to get the springs back in, I just did it in the reverse order I used to get them out. So I got the outer spring pan bolt and the sway bar end link attached. I inserted the spring and jacked up from the inside of the spring pan until those inner bolt holes lined up. Make sure that the spring is seated correctly against the top of the cross member before you start to compress the spring. Once you have all the spring pan bolts in, torque those down to 22 foot-pounds and the sway bar end link nut to 60 foot-pounds. Now you can finally put the front wheels back on and bring the car back down to the ground. Final step here is going to be to bounce on it a few times to get the bushing seated and compressed, then torque down the top nuts to 55 foot-pounds. After driving the car for a bit, torque those bolts down again just to make sure that they are good and tight. And then that's about all that there is to it. I hope this video is able to help someone out there, and if there's anything that I missed, feel free to let me know.